All right, everybody, welcome back to part two of section three, continuing on with the third day of our online lectures. And we left off talking about how the US started believing in the domino theory. That's going to be super critical going forward in chapters in the future. So make sure you know what the domino theory is. And so we left off talking about Vietnam and how the US will start to get involved in Vietnam. So today we will continue in section three with how the Cold War will spread to the Middle East. So in the 1930s, Jews will flee German anti-Semitism and sought safety in Palestine and will begin to call for the creation of a homeland for Jews. And yes, Palestine is its own country at this point in time. In 1948, Jews in Palestine will proclaim the new nation of Israel after the United Nations approved the creation of two states in this area. Conflict, however, will erupt as neighboring Arab states who were backed by the USSR will move to support the Palestinians while the US backs Israel. And so this will lead to a lot of tension. Yes, Israel ends up winning this brief war, which only lasts about a week, and this will set up Israeli dominance and the country to become an actual country recognized by the UN in 1948. They will defeat their neighboring Arab state neighbors, and this will be a lot of tension that will start in Israel. And so, as time goes on, we will talk more about this tension with Israel and the Palestinians, and just know that this was the beginning of all the violence. Well, the violence has been going on in the Middle East for thousands of years, the Crusades, but for the most part, this is what is going to really spark the violence in between Israel and the Palestinians. So, in 1952, the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA, will organize the overthrow of the pro-communist leader of Iran in order to prevent this oil-rich Arab nation from falling under Soviet influence. So the U.S. will restore the pro-American Shah of Iran to power despite the Shah's repressive policies. So, in other words, a pro-communist leader is in Iran. The U.S. doesn't like it, so the CIA goes in order to prevent the USSR and the Soviets from getting access to this oil. We will overthrow their pro-communist leader and establish a pro-American leader named who's going to be titled the Shah of Iran. With the biggest problem with reestablishing this person is he's not really popular with the Iranian people, and so this will start creating a distrust in America's true intentions as it deals with Iran, because we're supporting a very repressive leader who is going to start instituting a lot of Islamic code and laws into practice in Iran. And in 1956, we'll have the Suez Crisis in Egypt, and this does almost lead to World War III. This will be a very, very crucial event, and I will link a video in the description that will further explain the Suez Crisis in Egypt and how severe it is, so that way you can check that out as well. So, Suez Crisis. The Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser will seek Soviet economic support so that the US and Great Britain will end all promises of economic aid as a result of this. And probably not the best idea for us, because he's going to the Soviets for extra economic support. So instead of ending it, the US and Great Britain probably should have increased their aid to Egypt at this time. So Nasser will also suddenly seize control of the Suez Canal, and Great Britain, France, and Israel will now go in and attack the Egyptian government and the forces that have seized the Suez Canal. And so, facing the threat of Soviet intervention, President Eisenhower now will convince our NATO allies of Great Britain, France, and Israel to withdraw from Egypt and allow UN peacekeeping forces to come and maintain the ceasefire. Now, Eisenhower is very, very smart about doing this. So, because our NATO allies are willing to go to war and attack Egypt, which could then prompt the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union to come in and attack them as well, which would draw the U.S. into a very costly war with the Warsaw Pact. Instead, Eisenhower will talk them into withdrawing from Egypt, and now the UN will send in forces to help maintain a ceasefire and put an end to this crisis. And so, going forward from this, the US will learn a very, very important thing. And so, in order to prevent further communist aggression in the Middle East, President Eisenhower will propose the Eisenhower Doctrine. This is the third of the doctrines slash plans that we need to know, and this will occur in 1957. Remember, the other two are the Truman Doctrine, which provided aid to Greece, Turkey, and also promised military aid to any country trying to oppose Soviet influence. Then we had the Marshall Plan, which gave aid to all of Europe. And now we have the Eisenhower Doctrine, which was passed in 1957, and it will provide aid to any Middle Eastern nation threatened by communism and the support of U.S. forces when requested. So, once again, Eisenhower will increase the fact and knowledge to other countries that yes, the U.S. will help militarily if you request it. And now we're pledging to the Middle East under the Eisenhower Doctrine that we will help you with economic support. Also, so now we're going to be switching gears to the Middle East, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the Western Hemisphere. So, since the 1920s, the United States controlled the economies of at least 10 different Latin American nations through dollar diplomacy. Remember, William Howard Taft is the president that established dollar diplomacy, and we'll use our power to support pro-American governments here. In other words, because we have this money invested in their governments, we basically control them. We can basically also control who gets elected to be leader. So we're going to make sure it's always going to be a pro-American government there. And so after World War II, the US feared the spread of communism to Latin America, where a lot of US companies had large investments. If communism does spread to Latin America, where we have US investments in US companies, those companies will be taken over by the government. And in 1947, the US and 18 other nations of the Western Hemisphere will form a mutual defense pact called the Rio Pact. And later, this will form an organization called the OAS, or Organization of American States, in order to increase cooperation among member nations. So the Rio Pact will be the initial basically formed group and organization. Later, the Rio Pact countries will be renamed to the OAS, or Organization of American States. And so they're going to have this whole cooperative arrangement where they're basically going to go and try to do their best to prevent communist influence among each other. And so in 1954, the United States CIA will help in the overthrow of a quote unquote radical government of Guatemala when the government seized control of US business interests. So, new government gets established in Guatemala. They go in and seize control of U.S. business interests. This doesn't go over well, so, well, the United States sends in the CIA, and we overthrow that radical government that seized our business interests. Once that was done, we'll reestablish a more friendly to the U.S. government leader. Also in 1958, Fidel Castro will overthrow the corrupt Cuban government and dictator Fulgencio Batista with the help of the United States once again. So yes, we, the United States, did help Fidel Castro overthrow Batista, who was the dictator of Cuba at the time, and establish him as the leader of Cuba. So yes, we used to be allies with both Fidel Castro and Cuba. Afterwards, though, President Eisenhower refused to support Castro after the CIA reported possible communist infiltration in his group. So because the CIA may or may not have found members of Castro's group that have communist ties, the U.S. will now refuse to support Castro and his government. And now Castro will retaliate by seizing U.S. property in anger, and Eisenhower at this point will cut off diplomatic ties, and ever since then, the U.S. has banned exports to Cuba. Now, this ban is starting to lift, and we'll talk more about that when we get to JFK and the Cuban trade embargo. And so, in response, neighboring Cuba will then seek an alliance with the USSR for both military and economic aid. So, because we cut off all our trade and things to Cuba, well, they're going to be hurting economically, so they're going to turn to the USSR for both military aid and economic aid, which really isn't going to be quite what the US would have liked to happen. And also something to note for you guys as we switch gears again, throughout the 1950s, the United States and the Soviets will engage in what we call an arms race, or a struggle to gain weapon superiority as they fought for world leadership. Remember when Truman told Stalin about the nuclear weapons, Stalin wasn't so much worried and surprised that we had him because he already knew. He was more worried that the US might have military superiority over the Soviet Union now, and he was not very comfortable with that. And so the US government will use the fear of nuclear war to achieve Cold War objectives with a policy of brinksmanship. Brinksmanship is where you're willing to go to the edge of war in order to protect our nation's interests. So we're going to go all the way up to that line that will start a war. We're just going to stop right at that line so the war doesn't actually start. But brinksmanship can be very, very dangerous. And so there's going to be one big problem with our brinksmanship strategies. And that's because of our dependence on conventional air power to deliver our hydrogen bombs. We'll lag behind the Soviets in missile development. And missile development will be a very, very crucial thing going forward. So the United States will be forced to counter the Soviet development of ICBMs, or intercontinental ballistic missiles, which was a missile that had the capability of delivering an atomic warhead across the globe. So the Soviets will develop these first long-range missiles that are going to be very, very accurate. And the US is going to be way behind the Soviets on this. And so several events will make the US painfully aware of the technology gap that we face. First, in 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, which is the first artificial satellite to orbit Earth. And this really freaked people out because now everybody realizes, well, the Soviets are ahead of us. They got something in outer space way before we did, and now we're struggling to catch up. Also, in May of 1960, the Soviets demonstrated their missile technology once again by shooting down an American U-2 spy plane over the USSR. A, this made us look really bad, but B, it proved that these high altitude planes are still no matches for the missile technology that the Soviets have achieved. And though at first we denied the Soviet charge of espionage, Eisenhower eventually will have to take responsibility for this embarrassing incident when our U 2 spy plane is shot down. And the pilot, Francis Gary Powers, will be eventually released in an exchange of political prisoners with the United States. So Francis Gary Powers will be held captive for a period of time, but eventually we will get him back. So, in conclusion, well, first we got a couple pictures, Sputnik on the right, and also the New York Times the day it happened. So, view picture of U-2 spy plane, very, very high altitude, and this would be the prisoner exchange over a bridge. So, in conclusion, as the Eisenhower decade ended, the defense industry in the United States had grown to enormous proportions due to the expansion of the Cold War. President Eisenhower will try to warn America that the existence of a military industrial complex or alliance between the military and our industries, which will employ millions of Americans and which had financial stake in war making, could be a threat to peace. And now, the main question that Eisenhower leaves us with is now, was the dog wagging his tail or did the tail wag the dog? So the whole question is the US still in control of military and war, or is this a military industrial complex where people are making weapons for the military? Are they the ones now forcing us to go to war just so they can make money? So that is where I'll leave you at chapter 16. We will pick up chapter 17 tomorrow. And so make sure you have your chapter 17 stuff out and ready to go tomorrow. I just want to leave you with your homework assignment. There is a quiz online real quick for you guys to take. That'll be attached in the description below. And make sure you also do questions 56 through 77 in the chapter 16 question packet. That way you will be all caught up and ready to go. Once again, if you have any questions, feel free to email me.